me the story of Jesus, right from my heart every word. Tell me the story most precious, sweetest that ever was heard. Love in that story so tender, clearer than ever I see. Say, let me read while you whisper, love paid the ransom for me. Tell me the story most precious, sweetest that ever was heard.
Continue our study on the prophet Elijah. I'm not going to take the time to bring us up to where we are, because if I did, we'd be here in a month still trying to bring us up to where we are. This is number 5 on something that I thought would take 2 or 3 weeks, and we're at we're rapidly approaching verse 8 or something like that. There was a sermon that I preached a long time ago. I do not remember what it was about. I remember it had something in it about a toolbox that my dad had given me, and Wendy remembers that point. And it was, the toolbox was somewhere in about the middle of this thing. And the critique that I got at the end of the sermon, Conrad said, you should have quit at the toolbox. When you had them at the toolbox, you had everybody in the audience crying at the tool. You should have stopped there. Okay? I have a spot in this sermon that I think we're going to stop at, because it's a good place to stop. And so we may not go that long, but if I don't stop there to continue on, we'll lose the point, and we'll be, and then we'll have to go another 2 weeks to get to something. So even though it may seem, of course you never know, I can blabber on and on and on. It might be 3 hours before I get to that spot. But when we get there, I'm going to try and remember that critique, that I'm not talking about a toolbox, but if I get to the toolbox, when I quit, you'll know that we kind of at least got to the toolbox. If by chance anybody stumbles across any old sermons that I did in the 80s or the 90s, and happens to hear the story of the toolbox, would you please let us know what it was, what sermon it was, because I don't have a clue. I don't even remember, but you know, it was one of Wendy's favorites, and we don't remember what it was. We don't even know what the topic was. All we remember, and I don't even remember what I said about the toolbox, but we remember the toolbox. So anyway, that said, when we left Elijah last week, he was still at the brook. He had instructions to leave, and so we're going to assume over the course of the last week he left Kerith and headed towards Zarephath, because that's where God told him to go. And in 1 Kings chapter 17 and verse 9, this is where we get the injunction after the water is finally dried up in the creek, or the brook, or as my dad would call it, a crick. I don't know why people from Arkansas call a creek a crick, but I always thought a crick was that thing I got in my neck when I slept on my pillow wrong, but you know. Anyway, the water had dried up, and so God comes to Elijah in 1 Kings 17:9 and says, "Arise, get thee to Zarephath, which belongeth to Zidon, and dwell there. Behold, I have commanded a widow woman there to sustain thee." And I made the point last week that Christ had referred to this in Luke chapter 4, verse 25, where he said, "But I tell you of a truth, many widows were in Israel in the day of Elias, when the heavens was shut up 3 years and 6 months, when great famine was throughout all the land. But unto none of them was Elias sent, save to Zarephath, city in Sidon, unto a woman that was a widow." There's a couple of things we want to recognize from this. This was a true story. This story of Elijah was a true story. Jesus Christ, God manifest in the flesh, referred to this exact story as something that was a historical fact. This happened. This actually happened. All of this actually happened. He actually was fed by ravens by that brook for a year. He actually then did travel from the brook to Zarephath, where he's going to run into the next challenge that we'll get to today. This is a true story. And since it is a true story, and since the Apostle Paul tells us that the things that happen in the Old Testament are examples for us to follow, we can learn from it. We can learn how God deals with people, because God doesn't change. The way he dealt with the people in the Old Testament is exactly the same way that he deals with us. That's the main teaching that we get from the nation of Israel in the Old Testament, is to look at them and see how God dealt with them in any given situation. And if you can see how he dealt with them in any given situation, you can assume that he will deal with you in about the same way, because God doesn't change. That's the important part about that book, and it's one of the things that drives me so crazy about so many churches now that tell you not to bother. Don't bother reading that stuff. That's not for you. That wasn't written for you. And there's a lot of them that do that. The Gospels, those weren't written for you. Those were written for the Jews sometime in the future. They just want you to hang on to Paul's epistles. Well, you can't understand Paul's epistles if you don't understand what happened in the Old Testament, because he refers to the Old Testament all the time. You go through and look at that, and verse after verse, he's always referring back to something else. That was the way Paul preached. Paul would say something, then he'd quote a verse. Then he'd say something about that verse, and he'd quote another verse. That's why we preach the way we do in these churches. We follow Paul. That's the way he preached. That's the way we preach. That's the whole idea. But without knowing what went on back there, you can't really understand what the message that God sent. Okay? So bear in mind that what we're talking about here is history. It's a historical fact that this happened with Elijah, even so much that the historian Flavius Josephus referred to it as being history. The Jews believed this was just history. This was just like George Washington crossing the Delaware to them. It was the same thing. It's just a historical fact that happened. So we're told in 1 Kings chapter 17 and verse 10, boy, we're making headway now, aren't we? So he arose and went to Zarephath. And when he came to the gate of the city, behold, the widow woman was there gathering of sticks. And he called to her, and fetch me, I pray thee, a little water in a vessel that I may drink. The first point I want you to say, and this is something that Pink said. I keep referring to him because he wrote a really good book on this. He said, how can I minister the holy things of God unless I myself be treading the path of obedience? This is something that ministers have to pay close, very close attention to, but it's something that Christians have to pay attention to also, because we're nothing more nor less than examples to you. That's all we really are. We teach by example. We teach by what the Bible says. But it's our example that you're supposed to follow. If you're sitting out there wondering, well, how is it that I get along good with God? Well, I should do what the pastor would do. What would he do in that situation? And so that's why it's incumbent upon pastors to make sure that they live in such a way that you can follow them, that we don't lead you down some primrose path like so many false pastors have done over the years. That's why why it weighs so heavily on our hearts and minds, and why I'm so thankful of many times when the only two people in the car are Wendy and me, because none of you were there to see us and there's no webcam, because we're humans too. We stump too. We slam our thumbs in car doors just like everybody else does. And so, understand that we're people, but this is something that weighs on a minister. If he's a man of God, this weighs on him heavily. In Paul's day, to give you the contrary to this, think about in Paul's day. I want you to turn over to Romans chapter 2. Because the Jews at that time were God's ministers. even though they were wrong, you think about this, and I don't know, I haven't preached on this before, I don't think, but, or at least not here, but when you consider that even during the time of the apostles, when the apostles had the truth of the gospel, do you know that they still followed the law? Do you know that they still went to the temple on the feast days? Do you know that they still had sacrifices? You can read about this if you read the book of Acts. You'll find the Apostle Paul actually going through the process that he had gone through for all those years. Remember, Christ said that they sit in Moses' seat. They had the law. As long as they were here, they had the law, and you were to respect them even though they were wrong. Even though when it came to Christ, they were dead wrong, they were still God's system of worship at that time. And so the sacrifices didn't mean the same thing that they did. They weren't looking at their sacrifices as if it was something that would take sin away, because they knew that wasn't the case. But that never was the case. Those animal sacrifices never removed sin. The Jews had perverted the doctrine to think that they did, but they didn't. So even that during that time, they were following, they were being obedient to what God had said until such time as God wiped the Jews off the planet. Then they didn't have to be anymore. But as long as it was there, they were. Okay? But I want you to see what Paul had to say about these Jewish leaders in Romans chapter 2 and verse 19. Because this not only applies to me, but this applies to you as well. Okay? Talking about Jews, he said, "And art confident that thou thyself art a guide of the blind, a light of them which are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of babes, which hast the form of knowledge and of the truth in the law." You think about that. People can get very judgmental. They can get very holier than thou. They can become very pharisaical when they know they have the truth and other people don't. That's part of human nature that every one of us carries around within us. We can get to that point. And so Paul goes on and says in verse 21, "Thou therefore which teachest another, teachest thou not thyself? Thou that preachest that a man should not steal, dost thou steal?" That's something that every one of us has to consider and think about a lot. Do we walk the walk that we talk? When someone sees us wandering through life, do they see a Christian? Or do they see someone that's no different than anyone else other than he professes to be a Christian? What do they see? It is extremely important, especially for me, but also for you, that as we walk through this world, people see us as Christians. They don't just hear us say we are, that they see that we are. And that's one of the things that we can say about Elijah. Because in 1 Kings chapter 17 and 10, I want you to notice what it says. "So he arose and went to Zarephath." He didn't ask any questions. He just went. He did what God told him to do. And so the injunction to us is to do what God told us to do. And if you do what God tells you to do, then you don't have to worry about looking like a hypocrite. Because remember, the Jews didn't. They didn't follow God. They didn't do what he said to do. They just wore him on their sleeve. But they weren't obedient to him. And if you're obedient to him, then you don't have to fear whether or not you look like a hypocrite. If you're obedient, you're not a hypocrite. Does that make sense? Okay. I want you to notice something else. I pointed this out last week also. God doesn't always promise us a smooth ride in this world. There are times when our walk can get very, very rough and very rocky. But the road that we're given to walk is necessary for us. We don't all get the same road. We don't all get the same challenges. God knows what challenges are out there that will make us better. And those are the challenges we get. He knows what our problems are. He knows where our weaknesses are. We don't all have the same weaknesses. What I am weak at, many of you are strong. And areas where you are strong, or I'm not strong on anything if I keep going that route. Areas where you're weak, then maybe those are the areas where I'm strong. We're not all the same, and so as a result, our walk is not the same, and the problems that we face are not the same. As long as we're obedient, then we'll get by through this. We'll get through this world. It may not be what the fairy tale that we wanted it to be, but it'll be so much better than if we dig in our heels and say, no, I'm not going to do that. Because that's not going to work out well at all for anyone. I want you to turn to Hebrews chapter 12. I've spoken about this before. It's kind of a rabbit I'm going to chase, but I really want to get into this a little. On this point of obedience. In Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 5, Paul says, and you notice I'm one of those weird guys that actually believes that Paul wrote this book. A lot of people that you'll hear preachers say refer to the writer of Hebrews. Well, the writer of Hebrews is Paul. So why don't you just say Paul? Well, because liberal theologians have taught, well, we don't really know who wrote the book of Hebrews. Well, Paul wrote it, so just say that and move on. Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 5, and ye have forgotten the exhortation which speaketh unto you as unto children. My son, despise not the chastening of the Lord, nor faint when thou art rebuked of him. For whom the Lord loveth, he chasteneth and scourgeth every son whom he receiveth. If ye endure chastening, God dealeth with you as with sons. For what son is he whom the Father chasteneth not? But if ye be without chastisement, whereof all are partakers, then ye are bastards and not sons. That's an important thing to think about. If you can dig in your heels and be disobedient to God and sail through life, you're probably not a child of God. God chastens all of his children. All are partakers. We all get chastened by God when we get out of the way. When we slip, when we fall, we will pay for it. Conrad was famous as saying that the only hell that a Christian will ever know is this world. And yet this world is the only heaven that a non-elect person will ever know. So when you go through those times, when you realize, oops, I goofed, and maybe that's why I'm going through what I'm going through today, then don't goof next time. And as soon as you realize you goof, get down on your knees before the rod lands on your backside, because God chastens all of his children. Sometimes he does it just strictly to teach you a lesson. Sometimes he does it to pull you away from the pit. If you're getting too close, he might make things rough on you. He might turn up the heat to get you to come back to him, because that's what fallen human nature causes him to have to do. We are a messed up lot of folks, people. And God knows that and recognizes that, and so he does things to pull us back in when we start to go astray. Remember in Psalms chapter 23, I preached on this a while back, and in the 23rd Psalm, David said, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." You know, when you get down towards the end of that in verse 4, verse 3 says that he leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. You know what the rod is? The rod is the thing that God chastens you with. You say, well, how do I get comfort from getting spanked? Well, because you know you're a child. Because if you don't get spanked, You're probably not a child. You know, I have two sons that will attest to the fact that they know what the rod is. But I never spanked another kid in my life. The only two children I have ever spanked in my life are Blake and Josh. Those are my sons. I've spanked them. Never spanked anybody else's kids. Why? Because I'm not their dad. And it's the same here. If you're not getting spanked by God, you're not one of God's kids. Now the point is, as you get a little bit older, you don't want to get spanked anymore. You learn your lesson, you quit doing the stuff that gets you spanked, right? I mean, that's what we hope for in people, and also in just normal life, and also in your spiritual life. You learn your lessons and you quit getting spanked quite as much as you did to start with. But every one of us, when we're babies, we get paddled. That's just a fact. In Proverbs chapter 13:24, Solomon says, "He that spareth the rod hateth his son, but he that loveth him chasten him betimes." You see, the rod is connected with the chastening of God. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. The staff used for guiding the sheep, the rod used for beating them back in line when they need to be beaten back in line. Proverbs chapter 22 and verse 15 says, "Foolishness is bound in the heart of a child, but the rod of correction shall drive it far from him." I'm sure you all know people that seem to sail through life without a care in the world. Everything they do just turns to gold. Everything comes up rosy. They never have any issues. They never have any sorrow. They never have any problems whatsoever. We all know or have heard of these folks. And yet, guess what? Take advantage of what they have in this life, because this is the best it's ever going to get. Proverbs 23:13 says, "Withhold not correction from the child, for if thou beatest him with a rod, he shall not die." Neither of my kids died from me spanking them. I didn't die from my dad spanking me, and boy howdy. All my father had to do was hear the tone of my mother's voice when she said Bill. And my sister and I knew one of us was getting it, or both. That man could have his belt out of his pants faster than I could kick off a shoe. It didn't take, he was quick. It didn't kill me. It didn't kill me at all. And the rod of God's chastening is sent to correct a wayward child of God, to get him back on track. I want you to think about something. We know hardly anything at all about Elijah. We made that point in the very beginning of this study. We don't know anything about this guy. But I think you can probably assume that he had spent a lot of years out there in the wilderness, and he knew that God could chasten him. That much he knew. Why? Why do I say that? Because there's been 2 times already where God told him to do something, and he snapped to attention and saluted and said, "Yes, sir," and went and did it. That's why I say that, because most children don't do that until they've learned the lesson to be obedient. And Elijah had learned that lesson. Now, I don't have a Bible verse that says that, but I can assume that based on his behavior. You don't even find that kind of a behavior in the apostles during the time when they first started traveling with Christ. They did all kinds of bonehead stuff that they could have gotten spanked with. But Elijah, no, he just went. God told him go, he picked up and went. That's the lesson that we need to learn. God says go, you pick up and go. God says do this, you do it. If you don't do it, and if you dig in your heels long enough, then get ready, because there's a rod that God can use to make you do it. You will do it. We can do this the easy way, or we can do it the hard way, so to speak. You'll end up doing what God wants you to do. It just depends on how easily you want to make that on yourselves. And I want you to think of something else. While we go through this study on Elijah, I want you to, from time to time, put yourself into his position. Try to put yourself in his shoes. What would you do? What would you do if this was you and you had to live this life? And God called you to live the life that he called Elijah to do. What would you do? Here he went from the peace and the serenity of pasture land in Gilead to standing before Ahab, the wickedest king in the world, and announcing that there wasn't going to be rain or dew until he sees him again. And then he's sent to a brook out in the middle of nothing where he's going to be fed by ravens for a year and drink water out of the stream. And now he's sent over to some other Gentile city. How would we have done? How would we have fared in that? How would we have acted? You see, one of the things that God does a lot of times is he sends disturbances and disruptions and displacements to his children. It happens over and over and over again, where we just don't seem to be that settled in this world. And there's a reason. We have a good job and we lose it. We have another good job and we lose it. We're destitute for a while, and then we get another good job. We have a house and we lose it, and then we get another house. I mean, this is the way that life goes a lot of times for a lot of Christians. It's just one thing after another after another. That's part of dealing with this. And sometimes it's sent that way because God doesn't want us to get to a point that we start to take things for granted. And if we ever get to the point we start taking things for granted and we forget that everything that we have was a gift from him, he'll take it away from us and we'll end up having to start over again. That's a part of the way that he teaches us to be obedient and to be thankful. Turn over to Jeremiah chapter 48 and verse 11. See, one of the things he doesn't want us to do is rest on our lees. He doesn't want us to just get too comfortable. Remember, Solomon prayed that God wouldn't make him wealthy for fear that he'd forget him. And it's important that we don't get to a point where we start to take him for granted. Jeremiah 48:11 is talking about Moab. Now remember, Moab are not God's children. This doesn't say Israel. This is talking about somebody outside. And I just got through telling you about, you find these people that sail through life and don't seem to have any problems. They may not be God's children. Well, we're talking about that situation right here. It says, Moab hath been at ease from his youth, and he hath settled on his lees, and hath not been emptied from vessel to vessel. Neither hath he gone into captivity. Therefore his taste remaineth in him, and his scent is not changed. You see, these are the children that are not the children of God, and they haven't been emptied from vessel to vessel, and they haven't gone through the problems that God's children, Israel, had to go through. You see the comparison between the children of God, Israel, the children that are not the children of God, Moab. Do you see that comparison? How they sometimes sail through life without a care in the world, and God's children are emptied from vessel to vessel. And one of the reasons is so that we don't do what Moab did and start resting on our lees. So we don't take things for granted. One of the processes of being refined, one of the processes of being changed from rotten silver to good silver, if you will, from an earthen vessel to a golden vessel, if you will, is this process of being emptied from vessel to vessel. When you take something and you pour it from this cup to that cup to this cup to that cup, the impurities tend to rise to the top and you can scrape them off. That's how you get good stuff. You empty it from vessel to vessel, and that's what Elijah was going through. Elijah was being emptied from vessel to vessel. You think about what he had gone through over the course of just a couple of years. We're talking about maybe a year and a half, and he'd had all these disruptions. And think back about your life, some of the disruptions that you've gone through, and you look back and you can see, well, Was I being emptied from vessel to vessel? Is that what it took for me to get from where I was to where I am today? And then it makes you fearful. Am I going to have to go through this again? I got another one of these coming someday? Maybe. It's hard to say. But that's one of the reasons that God allows for these disruptions in the lives of His people, so they don't take things for granted. I mean, you think about it, God could very well have left Elijah sitting by that brook. He could have stayed there for the whole 3 years. God could have miraculously made sure there was water in that brook, but He didn't do it. That's not the way God wanted it done. So God disrupts his life again and sends him to Zarephath. He tells him, go to Zarephath. And what does he do? He arose and went to Zarephath. Didn't complain about it. Didn't ask why. Didn't say, well, maybe we could do it this way. You know, it's kind of like with Noah. You know, God comes down and tells Noah to build a boat. And I don't see anywhere where it says that Noah tried to cut a deal with him in using some other kind of wood or this or any. No, he just did it. That was one of the things that we can say about those Old Testament saints. When God told them to do something, they did it. And that's the lesson we need to learn. God tells you to do something, do it. When you know black and white that his book says do this or do that, then do it. And things will work out better for you. There's something else I want you to notice, and I want you to turn to Acts chapter 9. And while you're turning there, think about this. God didn't give Elijah any more information as to his future than he would be provided for by a widow woman. Go to Zarephath, I have commanded a widow woman there to sustain thee. That's it. Those are your instructions. Now get up and go. He didn't tell him any more than that. He hardly ever tells us any more than that. He never gives us a detailed plan, a business plan, if you will, as to what we can expect when we do what he tells us to do. We find that out when we do what he tells us to do. And then when we're obedient, then we get a little bit more information. And then when we're obedient to that, we get a little bit more information. That's the way things work. In Acts chapter 9, verse 1, it says, and Saul, this is talking about the future Apostle Paul, and Saul, yet breathing out threatenings and slaughter against the disciples of the Lord, went into the high priest and desired of him letters to Damascus to the synagogues, that if he found any of this way, in other words, Christians, because that's what he was looking for, if he found any of this way, whether they were men or women, he might bring them bound unto Jerusalem. And as he journeyed, he came near Damascus, and suddenly there shined round about him a light from heaven. And he fell to the earth and heard a voice saying unto him, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? And he said, Who art thou, Lord? And the Lord said, I am Jesus whom thou persecutest. It is hard for thee to kick against the pricks. And he, trembling and astonished, said, Lord, what wilt thou have me to do? And the Lord said unto him, and I'm sure that the Apostle Paul would have liked for Christ at that moment to say, well, I want you to do this, and then when you finish that, I want you to do this, and then when you're done with that, I want you to do this, and then I'm going to send you out to be the apostle of the Gentiles. That's what we would have liked to have heard, right? That's what I would have liked to have heard. I would have loved to know what the business plan was, but that's not what God told him. Look at what God says. Arise and go into the city. Arise and go into the city. That's it. You'll get further instruction when you get to the city. That's all I'm giving you for now. Go do that. Be obedient to that. Then you'll get some more. That's the way things work in this life. He generally never gives us any more information than just simply what's necessary for us to be obedient to him. And until we are obedient to that little bit of information he gives us, we're not going to get any more. You're just not going to get any more until you're obedient to the first chunk. And when you're obedient to that, then he'll give you more. But he won't give you any more until you learn to be obedient to the first. And so in 1 Kings 17:10 it says, so he arose and went to Zarephath. Remember what God told him. Go to Zarephath. I've commanded a widow woman there to sustain thee. So he arose and went to Zarephath. And when he came to the gate of the city, behold, the widow woman was there gathering of sticks. Not a widow, the widow. The very widow that God had commanded to sustain him was right there when he walked into the city. There she was gathering sticks. God works through providence to provide for his children, and he's done so throughout history. I mean, you might look at this and say, well, that's kind of an interesting circumstance that here Elijah shows up and she just happens to be there. She didn't just happen to be there. That's how God works. God never has you do something without working on the other side of the line to make sure that they do their part. He always works things out on both ends to play against the middle, if you will. He's always done that. He's in complete control of every possible situation that could ever come down the pike. He knows exactly what you will do given whatever circumstance comes before you. This is one of the reasons that the Bible says that he will never put you in a situation where you can't bear the situation. I'm paraphrasing, but most of you know the verse that I'm talking about. He'll never tempt you with anything that you can't bear. That option will never come available to you. If you have a problem and he knows that you would fall into sin and he's not going to allow it, you'll never have that situation approach you. It'll never come to you. You only get situations that he knows you can handle. And when you get options in your life that come before you, you have a couple of choices to make. One of them is you can follow God, and the other one is you can't. You don't. You either pick the one to follow God, or you pick the one to not follow God. Or several. You might have two or three, and all three of them are good, and three of them are bad, and you get to pick which one it is. And God knows which one you're going to pick, so guess what? He knows what the next choices will be. And if you pick wrong, he's going to punish you for it. And if you pick right, he'll bless you. That's how he deals with everything in this world. That's how it works. See, we don't believe that God absolutely predestines everything to happen like a fatalist would say. But God does absolutely predetermine everything that's going to happen. And so when he gives you a choice, look at the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. The Jews he had gotten this narrowed down to the point to where there were only two choices that they could have made. Christ came into the world at the time that the only government on the face of the earth in that part of the world that had the rights of capital punishment were the Romans. Up until shortly before Christ died, the Jews had the power to execute capital punishment. I don't know if you know that or not, but they'd lost it shortly before Christ came into the world. So at the time that Christ was in the world, in that part of the world, the only people that had the right to capital punishment were the Romans, and the only way that they punished people was by crucifixion. And that was the only form of punishment that would fit all of the prophecies in the Old Testament. So why did God bring Christ into the world then? Because that was the only time in the history of mankind that circumstance could have fallen out to fulfill all of those prophecies. You couldn't bring him into the world today. We don't crucify people today. The Jews that are sitting out there thinking we're still waiting for the Messiah, well, he's not going to fulfill those prophecies because that required that form of death. If you're going to fulfill the prophecies, that's the way you have to die. So he had to bring him into existence at that time. Now, when Pontius Pilate was standing there asking the Jewish leaders, what do you want me to do with this guy? Because I find no fault in him. They had a choice before them, didn't they? They could choose to crucify him, or they could choose to let him go. You see, you can always choose right. You can always choose just. You don't always have to choose bad. They could have let him go. God knew they wouldn't. But he had so narrowed it down to where they only had two choices. You crucify him or you let him go, and I know which one you'll pick. And so they chose to crucify him. And for that reason, his blood's on their hands, because they could have let him go. It's the same way with you. When these choices come to you, you can choose good or you can choose evil. If you choose evil, it's on your head. You're the one that made the choice, not God. That's why God deals in predetermination, not predestination. You know, the Arabs, the Muslims believe in absolute predestination. And so those guys that flew the airplanes into the tower, well, God made them do it. They were powerless. That's what fatalism teaches. Whatever I do it because God made me do it. He predestined before the foundation of the world that I was going to do this. And so when I do it, I'm just doing what God told me to do. Well, that's not the God of the Bible. The God of the Bible so arranges things to where his will is done, but you still have responsibility if you go the wrong route. You make the wrong choice, he still has the right to punish you. In Jeremiah chapter 10 and verse 23, it says, O Lord, I know that the way of man is not in himself. It is not in man that walketh to direct his steps. You don't get to pick which way you go and which way you don't go. You get to choose between the choices that God puts before you. He is in absolute and total control of everything that goes on this planet. Don't ever lose sight of that. Psalm 37:23 says, the steps of a good man are ordered by the Lord, and he delighteth in his way. Now, I want to look at a couple of examples of this. A couple of examples of how God works through providence to show you what I'm talking about. And the first one we're going to find, turn over to Genesis chapter 42 and verses 1 through 8. I'm going to tell you a little story first, and then we'll get to this passage. Jacob, who eventually ended up being called Israel, had 12 sons. And of these 12 sons, one of them was his favorite, and that was Joseph. And Joseph had had a dream. And in this dream, Joseph had dreamed that his brothers were all going to bow down to him. Well, he made a mistake and told them the dream, and they kind of got mad at him and thought he was an arrogant little jerk, and who do you think you are, you little punk, and he was just one of those kids that I guess you probably like to beat on. But he there came an occasion when all the other brothers were out tending the sheep, and Jacob sends him out there to check on him, and he goes out there, and they decide they're going to get even with this little jerk for all of these dreams he's been having. And they start off by throwing him in a pit while they're trying to figure out, what are we going to kill him? What are we going to do about this guy? Well, unfortunately, some Bedouin slave traders happen to come by and pick the kid up and carry him off into Egypt. And when they get back to the pit, he's gone. So they go back and they tell their dad that wild beasts ate him. And they showed him the coat that the dad had made that was now torn and had blood on it. And so, so now Joseph goes into Egypt. And over I don't want to make this too long. This isn't a story about Joseph, but over a period of years, Joseph is elevated to the second man, number 2 man under Pharaoh. You got Pharaoh at the top, and Joseph is number 2. It's interesting how God has done that a couple of times. Look at Daniel. He was in kind of the same position with Nebuchadnezzar. Way up high in the court. That's happened from time to time. God puts his people in those positions for very specific reasons. Okay? So now you have Joseph down in Egypt. And one of the reasons that he was elevated as high as he was because Joseph had a gift for interpreting dreams. And he had interpreted a dream with Pharaoh that there would be 7 years when they would have plenty, and then there would be 7 years of famine. And so the idea was that during the 7 years of plenty, you should stock up everything you've got. Put it all back. Get it in the bank. Because we're going to have these years of famine coming upon us here pretty quickly, and you're going to want to be able to live off of what you put in the bank during the time when times were good. It's valuable advice to have. We should heed that. When you have those years of plenty, don't go blow all the dough. Put some of it in the bank. Well, so what Pharaoh did was he was stocking up corn. When the years of famine rolled around, guess what he had that nobody else had? He had corn. And so when people came to him to buy corn, well, he basically bought the entire nation of Egypt out from underneath him because he had the money to do it with. Okay? Well, wouldn't you take somebody like that was an inside trader like that knew what was going to happen and elevate him? Of course you would. This would be your right-hand man. This is the guy that controls the food sources during these times of famine. Now we come to Genesis chapter 42, beginning at verse 1. Now when Jacob saw that there was corn in Egypt, Jacob said unto his sons, why do you look one upon another? What are you doing just standing there staring at each other? Go do something. That's the way what my dad used to say to me. And he said, behold, I have heard that there is corn in Egypt. Get you down thither and buy for us from thence, that we may live and not die. And Joseph's 10 brethren went down to buy corn in Egypt. But Benjamin, Joseph's younger brother, Jacob sent not with his brethren, for he said, lest peradventure mischief befall him. And the sons of Israel came to buy corn among those that came, for the famine was in the land of Canaan, and Joseph was the governor over the land. And he it was that sold to all the people of the land, and Joseph's brethren came, watch this, and bowed down themselves before him with their faces to the earth. You remember the dream that Joseph had that got him in trouble? And here they are doing exactly what the dream was all about. And Joseph saw his brethren, and he knew them, but made himself strange unto them, and spake roughly unto them. And he said unto them, whence come ye? And they said, from the land of Canaan to buy food. And Joseph knew his brethren, but they knew him not. Now, I want you to think about something. God put Joseph in that position for the exact reason that there was going to be famine in the land, and to provide for his people, Jacob, Israel. He had someone in the government to take care of them when the time came that they needed to be taken care of. If God raises you to that type of a position, do not think that you're special. You may be in that position for the exact reason that you're there to take care of his children in some other way. Always remember that. Always remember that God can raise people up and he can cut them down. Joseph wasn't there simply because he was so much better than everyone else. He was there because God put him there. God's the one that gave him the interpretations to those dreams that by which Pharaoh was able to then raise him up. So don't ever get to the thinking that because I'm in this high spot. I mean, I look at my service on the Appraisal Institute board. Do you know why I'm there? Because it's the only way I would have ever been convinced to come to Lakeland, Florida. Because I met somebody on the board that's from Lakeland, Florida. It wasn't because I was special. It wasn't because I was smarter than anybody else. It's because that's where I needed to be to get me to do what he wanted me to do. And it was exactly the same with Joseph. And it's exactly the same with you. Don't ever lose sight of that. Look at Joshua chapter 2. Joshua chapter 2, verses 1. Now, let's think again. Historically, God is sending the children of Israel in, and they're going to destroy. The first city they destroyed was the city of Jericho. And they send spies into the city. You remember that story? They send these spies into the city. And it says in Joshua chapter 1, and Joshua, the son of Nun, sent out of Shittim 2 men to spy secretly, saying, go view the land, even Jericho. And they went and came into an harlot's house named Rahab and lodged there. If the story stopped there, that would not sound good, would it? We send these 2 spies of God into town. They go to the whorehouse. That's probably not the best call. But if we keep reading, it makes better sense. And it was told the king of Jericho, saying, behold, there came men in hither tonight of the children of Israel to search out the country. These people were scared to death of the Israelites. And now they find out these spies came in here. And the king of Jericho sent unto Rahab, saying, bring forth the men that are come to thee, which are entered into the house, for they be come to search out all the country. And the woman took the 2 men and hid them, and said thus, there came men unto me, but I wist not whence they were. She lied to him. This person from Jericho lies to the king and hides these men on the roof. And it came to pass about the time of shutting the gate, when it was dark, that the men went out. Whether the men went, I wot not. Pursue after them quickly, for ye shall overtake them. They took off already. You might want to get on your horses, get the posse together, and go after them. But she had brought them up to the roof of the house, and hid them with the stalks of flax, when she had laid in order upon the roof. And the men pursued after them the way to Jordan unto the fords, and as soon as they were pursued after they were gone, they shut the gate. The spies are sent in. God knows that these spies don't have a chance if they get caught. But he had a child of God in that place. She was a harlot, but she was a child of God. You say, how in the world can you say she was a child of God? Because what it says over in Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 10 says, by faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they were compassed about 7 days. By faith the harlot Rahab perished not with them that believed not. She didn't perish with the ones that believed not. Why? Because she wasn't one of the ones that believed not. She was one of God's children. God knew she was there. That's why the spies showed up at her house. God always deals in ways to provide for his children, regardless of what the outward circumstances are. The story, I'm not going to read this, but I'm going to give you a homework assignment. I want, later on, over the course of the week, I want you to read the book of Esther. It's not a very big book, 6 or 7 chapters, but the story of Esther is, I'll give you the Reader's Digest condensed version just to hook you in here. The story of Esther is a story of a Jewess who had married the king of Persia. Now you remember during the times of Daniel, the Babylonians controlled the world, and then the Media-Persian Empire came in, the Medes and the Persians that were, I think, the bear with the 2 ribs in his mouth, that empire came in. Well, the king of Persia was a pretty powerful dude. And Persia is where Iran is today. A lot of people don't know that. Iran, the people that live in Iran are not Arabs. The people that live in Iran are Persian. That's where Persia was. And so this was the king of Persia. He had a wife named Vashti that made the horrible mistake of interrupting him and walking into his room when he hadn't called for her, and she ended up not being there anymore as the queen. That was enough to cause, you're out of here. Okay? Well, he spies Esther, who was, I guess, a hottie. It's the only thing I can see. She was obviously gorgeous. And he takes Esther to be his wife, among many others, and Esther was his favorite. But Esther was a Jew. There was another guy in his kingdom by the name of Haman, and Haman was a jerk. We've all met these kind of guys. We all know these guys that think that everybody's supposed to bow down to them, that they're so important, that they're the cat's meow, that the sun rises and sets on their head. That was Haman. And Haman worked for the king. And there was another guy that most people pronounce his name Mordecai. If you look in the Bible, though, and you have those little symbols, it looks like it's Mordecai. You can pronounce it any way you want to. I'm going to go with the Mordecai because it's different and because that's the way the King James makes it look. So if I'm messing up his name, I apologize. But anyway, he was one of these guys that just refused to bow down to Haman. He didn't recognize Haman's power, and he wasn't going to bow down to him. Just wasn't going to do it. He was a Jew. He was also the uncle of Esther. Remember, the wife of the king. Well, Haman he comes up with a plan, and he gets it approved by the king that in a year, any Jews that live within the boundaries of the Persian Empire will be put to death. See, Hitler wasn't the first guy to come up with that one. Haman came up with that one. We're going to destroy them all. And the reason they wanted to destroy them all was just because of Mordecai. He just got mad at Mordecai because he wouldn't bow down to him. So I really, all I want to do is kill Mordecai, but I can't just get away with that one. So I'll kill them all. Nice guy, huh? Well, Mordecai is then bemoaning this, and he's talking back and forth to Esther, and he tells Esther, you need to go tell the king, because you're a Jew, and this will fall on your head as well, and the king's already signed the law. You need to go talk to the king. Well, she was fearful. She didn't want to go talk to the king because of what had just happened with Vashti. She interrupted him, and look what happened to her. You see, you're going to want to read this book to get the whole story. It's a really great story. So anyway, in Esther chapter 4 and verse 13, so I don't take too much time on this, Esther chapter 4 verse 13, it says, then Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. You think you're going to get away with this? You think he's not going to kill you? You're a Jew too. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then there shall be enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. You see, if you don't do this, God will still get the job done. Whether you do it or not, God will still get the job done. He's not going to let his people suffer from this. Whether you are obedient or not, God will still get his work finished. You can't thwart that. That's what he's saying to her. If thou holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place, but thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. You see, that's something that we have to remember every day of our lives. Okay, I can choose not to be obedient to God, but that's not going to thwart God's plans. there will be deliverance from somewhere else. You stop and think about this. Look at the number of churches that have passed away, so to speak, where the people decided no longer to be obedient. Did that end the church? No. It ended it there, but it didn't end the church. It didn't bring it into the church. God took care of that. You can't thwart God's plans. You can't stand up against Him and destroy something that He promised would be here. You might try, but you won't be successful at it. And that's what He's telling Esther. You don't want to go talk to him, fine, don't go talk to him, but that's not going to change the matter that God's still going to provide for His family, but you're going to lose yours. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Esther, how do you know that the exact reason that you are in the position you are in today is because of what Haman is trying to do, and you're the one that has to save the day? How do you know? You see, God always works on both sides of the coin, and He always works to provide for His children. Think about the Ethiopian eunuch over in Acts chapter 8 when he was sitting in the chariot reading the Bible and wishing that he could understand it. What happened? Philip showed up and explained it to him. Think about Cornelius over in Acts chapter 10, praying to God, trying to understand the Bible, and what happens? God sends Peter to him. God's always working. He's always working on both sides. He's always provided for His people. So now I'm going to ask you a question. Why is it that we always sweat over the small stuff? Every one of us do. Or maybe I'm alone in this. Maybe I'm the only guy that sweats over the small stuff, but I doubt it. Because humans do that. We sweat over all this little... Why do we worry how am I going to get by? How am I going to pay this bill? How am I going to pay that bill? How am I going to do this, and how am I going to do that? It's time to give up on how I'm going to do something and realize that God is going to take care of it. He always has. My call is to be obedient to God and let Him take care of the small stuff. I've seen people that will hold on to a nickel so hard that it will bleed. That if they could get blood out of that nickel, they would get blood out of it, and they got a bag full of nickels over here in the corner. But I ain't letting go of this one. I'm going to hold on to this until I get blood out of it, because this might be the last nickel I get. When some poor guy sitting out here has nothing, and you could have made his life a whole lot better by sharing that nickel with him when you got a bag full of them over here. And understand that maybe the reason you have that nickel is to share with that guy. Maybe that was the reason God gave you the nickel to begin with. And we need to remember that. We need to remember that God gives us things so that we can use them to further the kingdom of God, and not to just build upon ourselves so that we feel good about ourselves. That's not our call here. Is that what Elijah did? Did Elijah gather up all of the food that the ravens brought him for a year and carry a bag of food with him when he went to Zarephath? No. Sometimes we get to the point where we think it's all about us. That my career is the most important thing in the world, and oh yeah, well, God's important too. But my career, that's what's important. That's what's going to provide for my family. It's my career. It's my job. It's what I do. That's the important thing, and then I'll make sure that I've got a little bit of time left over for God. That's not how it works, people. Turn to Matthew chapter 6. We're going to begin in verse 24. Maybe this is the way it is for people outside there. For people that are not children of God, this makes sense. But for children of God, you live in a different world. You live in a different kingdom. Your worldly outlook should be different. You should be more concerned with God's kingdom than you are with the rest of that stuff out there. And this is what Jesus Christ says in Matthew 6:24, "No man can serve two masters. For either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. Ye cannot serve God and mammon. Therefore I say unto you, take no thought for your life, what ye shall eat or what ye shall drink, nor yet for your body, what ye shall put on. Is not the life more than meat, and the body more than raiment? Behold the fowls of the air, for they sow not, neither do they reap, nor gather into barns, yet your heavenly Father feedeth them. Are ye not much better than they? Which of you by taking thought can add 1 cubit unto his stature? And why take ye thought for raiment? Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They toil not, neither do they spin. And yet I say unto you that even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. Wherefore, if God so clothe the grass of the field, which today is and tomorrow is cast into the oven, shall he not much more clothe you, O ye of little faith? Therefore take no thought, saying, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or wherewithal shall we be clothed? For after all these things do the Gentiles seek. For your heavenly Father knoweth that ye have need of all these things. But seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. Take therefore no thought for the morrow shall take thought for the things of itself. Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof. God works in providence, and he's always taken care of his people. And he always will. And so don't sweat the small stuff. Don't worry about what are we going to do tomorrow, how are we going to do this, God will take care of it. He'll get you through it. Be obedient to him. If he tells you to do something, do it. And he'll take care of you. And he's always done it this way. And so he told Elijah to go to Zarephath, and a widow woman would sustain him. And so Elijah arose and went to Zarephath. And that's what we're to do as well. When God sends us to Zarephath, we're to go to Zarephath. Whatever he commands us to do, that's what we are to do. 1 Kings 17:10, and when he came to the gate of the city, behold, the widow woman was there, gathering of sticks, and he called to her and said, fetch me, I pray thee, a little water in a vessel that I may drink. He was probably kind of thirsty. He just walked about 100 miles. Notice he didn't order her around. He was very polite to her. Verse 11, and as she was going to fetch it, he called to her and said, bring me, I pray thee, a morsel of bread in thine hand. I'm probably hungry too. I don't know if the ravens followed him all the way and fed him along the way, but the Bible doesn't say, but he was probably hungry. So here he shows up, he's tired and he's hungry. He's at the place where God sent him because this widow woman is going to sustain him. And so he asked her for water in a drought. Remember, this drought had affected this land as well. They didn't have any water. That was a commodity that was worth a lot of money. She didn't have a problem going to get it, and we'll cover more of that next week. But she went to get the water, and then he stops and asked her for some little thing to eat. Can you spare a guy a nickel? Can you help out a guy that just walked all the way across here? Look at verse 12. And she said, as the Lord thy God liveth. We're going to deal with that next week too. Notice it says the Lord thy God. It doesn't say the Lord my God. As the Lord thy God liveth, I have not a cake, but a handful of meal in a barrel and a little oil in a cruse. And behold, I am gathering 2 sticks, that I may go in and dress it for me and my son, that we may eat it and die. She was down to her last meal. She had nothing but a little bit of meal in a barrel and a little bit of oil, and she didn't even have any fuel to cook it with. She was out wandering around trying to find a couple of sticks so that she could cook this, so her and her son could have their last meal and die. Remember, I asked you to think about putting yourself in the position of Elijah. What would you do now? Elijah sends him to Zarephath, where a widow woman is going to sustain him, and this is what he finds. Could things get any worse? He didn't send him to the millionaire in town. He sends him to a widow woman that doesn't have any food. How's she going to sustain him? How is she going to take care of Elijah? She can't take care of herself. She's down to nothing. So I ask you, what would you do? Well, what did Elijah do? When times got horribly bad, like they did here, and I got to tell you, this would make it look pretty bad. Well, did he lose faith? Did he give up on the church? Did he throw in the towel? No. No, he didn't. Because what we're going to see is that he did exactly the opposite of that. Why? Because Elijah had just spent a year by a brook where God fed him with ravens. You see, Elijah had had the experience of God and the experience of God's providence. God understood that God could see through this situation. He didn't look at the outward circumstances of what he was facing. He knew that God was in control. He knew that even if this is my last nickel that I'm giving in obedience to God, like this woman was with her handful of meal, that's okay. There'll be another one around the corner. God will take care of it, as we're going to see next week. And I want you to remember something else. God had told Elijah to arise and get to Zarephath, which belongeth to Zidon, and dwell there. Behold, I've commanded a widow woman to sustain thee. And I've been over this the last couple of times. God cannot lie. So if he told Elijah that a widow woman would sustain him, then a widow woman will sustain him. And if God makes a promise in his book, he cannot lie. You have nothing to worry about. If you're one of God's children, if you've ever felt the chastening hand of God upon your back because you got out of line, if you've ever felt the leading of God, there's a place in Romans where it says that whosoever is led of God is a child of God. I'm paraphrasing again. If you've ever felt that, and you know that you're a child of God by experience, then what are you afraid of? You have nothing to fear. The only fear you have is to not be obedient to what God tells you to do. And if you're obedient to him, you have nothing to worry about. So remembering that he cannot lie, and think about this, if he raised the dead, then he can certainly provide for Elijah and this woman and her son. And it's sometimes, sometimes when things seem the bleakest, sometimes when things get hard, that's when we start to see the providence of God. When we get to the point to where we realize, I can't do this by myself. There's no way in the world I can do this by myself. There's no out. I have no way out. When I was in those days of shaking coffee grounds off of lettuce leaves, I was at the point realizing I can't do this by myself. Sometimes that's what it takes to get you to the point that you realize that somebody else is watching over you and that somebody else is God Almighty. And that sometimes is what it takes to get you to the point that you need to be at, where you are obedient to Him. Ephesians chapter 3. I want you to turn here. This will be one of our last passages. Ephesians chapter 3 and verse 14. It says, "For this cause," this is a prayer of the Apostle Paul. This is the way Paul prayed. "For this cause I bow my knees unto the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, of whom the whole family in heaven and earth is named, that He would grant you, according to the riches of His glory, to be strengthened with might by His Spirit in the inner man, that Christ may dwell in your hearts by faith, that ye being rooted and grounded in love may be able to comprehend with all saints what is the breadth and length and depth and height, and to know the love of Christ which passeth knowledge, that ye might be filled with all the fullness of God. Now to Him that is able," now watch this, "that is able to do exceeding abundantly above all that we ask or think." Think about the widow woman. Is God able to do exceeding abundantly above all that she could ask or think? We're going to see next week. We'll see what God's answer was to this poor widow woman that was down to a handful of meal in a barrel. It's all she had left, that and a little bit of oil. And now she's got a prophet she's got to feed. How in the world am I going to feed this guy? I can't feed myself. I don't have enough to get by on my own, and now I got to feed this guy too? We'll see that God's able to do exceeding abundantly. But there's something else we're going to see too, and that is that before He did exceeding abundantly, she had to give up the meal. She had to feed the prophet. And it was when she was obedient and did that God did exceeding abundantly above all that you could ever ask. Now to Him that is able to do exceeding abundantly above all that we ask or think, according to the power that worketh in us, unto Him be glory in the church by Jesus Christ throughout all ages, world without end. Amen. Elijah knew that God could do exceeding abundantly above all that we ask or think. And so he didn't concern himself with the outward circumstances or the financial condition of the widow woman that he was sent to, but he put his faith in God, knowing that God would find a way so long as he was faithful and obedient to Him. One of my favorite passages in the whole of the Bible, and this sums the whole thing up, is found over in Ecclesiastes chapter 12 and 13. And if you ever sit in my car when I start it, you'll notice I've got one of those little things that comes up that you're able to program a little message to yourself, you know, on the little computer screen thing. Well, that's the verse that comes up. Because this is the one I want you to remember this forever. I want you to mark this one on the table of your heart and carry this with you forever. Because after Solomon had tried everything under the sun to try to find out what was worthwhile and what was good and what was bad and how you should live your life, he came to this conclusion. Remember Solomon, the wisest man that ever lived apart from the Lord Jesus Christ, said in Ecclesiastes 12:13, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Well, what is it, Solomon? Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. You want to know what God wants from you? Fear Him and keep His commandments. That's it. That's as simple as it is. It doesn't get any more complex than that. And this is a really good place to stop. And so we will close for this week. We'll come back next week and we'll see how it is that God deals with feeding Elijah when he has nothing more than a widow woman that has a handful of meal and a little bit of oil and 2 more years of drought to deal with. And we'll also see some other remarkable things that God did in the life of this widow woman, because she was faithful to do what God asked her to do, which was provide for that prophet. And so with that, I thank you for your kind and patient attention, and let's go to the Lord in prayer.